Good morning. My name is Sarah Kaler, and I want to welcome you all to the Ottawa Area Chamber of Commerce Legislative Coffee for March. Want to do some quick thank yous before, because I know y'all want to run out the door at the end. Some quick thank yous. I do want to thank the Area Chamber of Commerce, the Legislative Action Committee, Franklin County Farm Bureau Association, and AT&T for their sponsorship. Today, refreshments are brought to you by the Franklin County Republican Central Committee, and the City of Ottawa obviously provides us this facility and coffee. Matt and Paul are in the back and actually make sure that we all look good on film, so thank you, Matt and Paul. We appreciate it. We are going to start today without any further ado, and I think I'm going to start this morning by giving you guys just a few minutes just to tell us who you are, if we don't know, and tell us what you've been doing. So, you want to start, Representative Finch?
Thank you very much. I want to thank the Chamber this morning for having us out, hosting us, and I think it was the Republican Central Committee that brought treats this morning. Thank you for giving everybody some nourishment. My name is Blaine Finch. I represent the 59th District. That is the western half of Franklin County, including Ottawa, and then a bit of Osage County around Linden. But before we jump into issues this morning under the State House, I want to talk about something that some of you may have read about or seen in the news over the last week, and that's some allegations about a dinner that took place in Topeka last month. Those accusations are salacious, and they're headline-grabbing, and they're not true. If they were, I wouldn't be here before you this morning. I'd be too embarrassed. But I am here, head up, looking you in the eye, telling you these accusations are false. For 2.5 decades, I've been involved in some type of public service for this community, the county around it, and the people who I call my friends and neighbors. I take very seriously my role as an ambassador for this community, whether I'm home or away. My parents raised me to always act responsibly, decently, with kindness towards all people, and to tell the truth. And that's what I try to do all the time. When I was elected into leadership in the House, there were a few surprises. Some good, like the opportunity to help on bills like those that were important to our animal shelter and to our county sheriff this year, bills that might not have otherwise gotten through the process if I hadn't been where I was. But there were some that were unpleasant, and maybe they shouldn't have been, because I'm not exactly new at this game. One of them was the number of people in politics who want nothing more than to tear others down, especially those who are serving in positions of leadership. I was also surprised by the lengths they would go to and the stories they would tell to make that happen. I'm not going to give in to those people now, and I didn't give in to them before when they have attacked me, and I hope that you will stand with me. I'm going to stick around this morning after this coffee is over, like I do every month, and I'll take any and all questions you have about this or any other issue. But I wanted to get this out before we talk about the issues that matter to Kansas, because the people who attack want nothing more than to distract us from the issues that matter. Issues like our mental health system, protecting our foster kids, schools, improving our transportation infrastructure, and taking care of our state. I want to thank all of you for the opportunity to talk with you this morning. I want to thank you for coming out and being interested in the issues and interested in our state and what happens. And I want to thank you for the distinct honor and privilege of representing the people of Ottawa, Franklin, and Osage counties in the Kansas House. Thank you. I look forward to your questions this morning.
Senator Tyson?
Thank you, and thank you for your for our sponsors, and for being here this morning. And I'm sure that was very rough for Representative Finch. I handed out some of my year-end newsletters, and if you get a chance, you can grab one in the back. And it is in there that we have come to a new low in politics. We have put politics above policy. And that is not good for anyone, not good for our state, not good for our communities. I ask you to join me in rising above it. let's put policy first. Let's get some good legislation for Kansas by working together. Again, I thank you for coming out this morning. It's a great crowd. Beautiful morning out. It's been a cold winter. Cold on the ranch and cold in Topeka. We have not had a lot of activity in Topeka. It's been a different year for many reasons. We did get capers passed. We passed it unanimously. I was one of the co-sponsors on the bill. What it did was required a previous payment that had been delayed that I did not support by the previous administration either in delaying that payment. So I was extremely excited to co-sponsor a bill to push that through, to force the payment, saving the state millions of dollars. The governor did sign it into law, and so that was good. It passed both chambers unanimously. We've got KDOT issues before us we've been working on. We've got a deer hunting bill. We've got tax. Tax has passed both chambers now. It's on the senator's or the governor's desk. There's a lot of legislation still that needs to be worked. School funding, the budget, several other items. And I look forward to your questions this morning.
Representative Samsel?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Happy Big 12 Tournament Championship Day. You've seen me. I've got my Jayhawk on up here. I was hoping to get a rematch with our friends who like wearing purple a little bit more, but with Dean Wade sitting out, I guess we'll have to wait for the national championship game in the NCAA tournament this year. But it reminds me, I was fortunate enough to be at the K-State game for senior day there, and I am a Jayhawk through and through, but Dean Wade is by far my favorite player in the state of Kansas and probably the country. I got to go down and get a picture with Barry Brown, and it brings me back to senior leadership. If you remember back in your days, a freshman in high school, perhaps a freshman in college, who do you look to follow their lead? It was often the seniors. They've got two great seniors there in Manhattan, Kansas, Dean Wade, Barry Brown, and they're following their leadership, and I think it's going to take them a long way in the tournament. I use that analogy because I've got two outstanding seniors next to me. I don't mean that by age, I mean that by experience. They're in the state capitol building. But on the tough issues that come through, I do want you to know that you've got two of the best leaders here in the state of Kansas. They care deeply about what goes on. We're going to agree and disagree on some of the issues, but you won't find harder working or more caring individuals. And so it is unfortunate. We'll never know what happened there in Topeka, but I do know at the end of the day, when there's an issue coming through the floor, Blaine Finch is the first person I go to pick his brain and see where we're at on the issues and what's the right thing for Kansas. So if I could, just very briefly here, I was out at the state basketball tournament reffing some games for the kid, and I probably shouldn't use this word in public, but one of my officials told me I bloviate. So I didn't know what that word, I had to Google it, but that means I'll ramble if I don't stick to my bullet points here. So, and he was true, so I'm trying to learn from that.
We can turn on your mic.
Yes.
Off and on your mic, we know that, right?
Huh?
If you talk too long, we can turn your mic off.
Yes, please, or Senator Tyson has the gavel if you want to bang that at any given time. So, but very quickly here, I do want to welcome and introduce, for those of you who haven't had the opportunity to meet yet, our Wellsville School District's been blessed with the addition of Ryan and Emily Bradbury. Would you guys mind standing, please, just so everybody can see who you guys are? If you haven't met them, please do before the day's over. They're outstanding. I'm excited for the new local leadership in our school. They've got two wonderful kids, one of whom's been able to spend the day with me in the state capitol. It was a great experience for everybody. And frankly, our district, House District 5, once they get to meet our good people, we are leading the way in a lot of way over in the state capitol. So very quickly, I'll wrap this up. But what I do hope we touch on today is health care. One of the things I've learned is that we are paying for everybody's health care in some way, shape, or form. But so I hope we get into that one because we're trying to do some fixes here at the state level where they're coming through. CanCare, Medicaid expansion, the Farm Bureau bill. I applaud efforts to try to find ways. Unfortunately, I think the biggest solution is going to be at the federal level, but I look forward to discussing those things. And then what Representative Finch mentioned, though, while we're working on these things, what we really haven't been able to hit on as much yet is the mental health and a number of other things, so I hope we get to touch on that. And then the biggest thing that I've learned here is the process. And I'll close my opening with this. but you have three of the hardest working folks in Topeka. I thought I knew what hard work was before, but from the time I wake up on Monday morning until I go to bed on Saturday, it's nonstop. This job comes first. I've got to balance in our legal job. That's what pays the bills. And then by the time Sunday gets around, we're exhausted in recovery. But Braxton Spencer is one of our best from Garnett, Kansas. He's in my district. He's very high energy, bouncing around all over the place. He was with me for 3 days over his spring break. I was encouraged to see that when we came home after the second day, he was more tired and was ready to go to bed before I was. So as much as I'm starting to get older, I still lasted longer than he did on that day. So that was encouraging. So with that, I'll close before you have to cut off my mic. Thank you.
Well, Representative Sampson, we want to welcome you. I know this is your first legislative coffee, so we're excited to have you and excited to hear your input. So thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to dive right in, and Senator Tyson had referenced this bill, and I'm going to start with my very first question. I do want the audience to know that I'm going to take questions from you here in just a little bit. We have a lovely rover who is Laurel, who's going to have the mic, so she will do that in just a few minutes. But first, Senate Bill 22 saw some really lengthy debate on the House floor about a week ago. This tax bill now sits on the governor's desk. From your point of view, tell me what are the merits of the bill and how Senate Bill 22 is going to help the citizens of Ottawa and Franklin County.
Senate Bill 22 is a tax bill dealing with the tax cuts from 2017 at the federal level. That may sound foreign to you. Why do we have to adjust our state taxes because of federal cuts? But if we don't, we will have a tax increase for some Kansas taxpayers. And it's a considerable increase, estimated anywhere, I've seen the numbers from 100 million to 180 million to maybe even more. But for individuals, if you itemize on your tax return, a majority may not be able to itemize because the standard deduction raised at the federal level to $24,000 for married filing jointly. What this bill does is allows Kansans the option to itemize on your tax return, your state tax return, because you cannot itemize on your state return currently if you do not itemize on your federal return. Another portion of the bill dealt with GILTI and repatriation, which those tend to be corporations that deal with that. It's offshore money that can and will come home to Kansas if we do the right thing. And I say the right thing because we have never taxed that money before. The president was encouraging that money to come home. These are mostly large corporations or individuals that have other sites in the nation, and they can choose to use those other sites to bring the money home instead of bringing it to Kansas. So that's another portion of the bill. That's where you hear that it's favoring corporations, that it's over individuals. That's not correct. It's money that's never been taxed before. And if we do put a tax on it, most likely that money will not come back to Kansas. The other, that's what passed out of the Senate. Now, it went to the House, and the House made two significant changes to it. One of them was a decrease in food sales tax. I have fought for a decrease in food sales tax since I was elected in the House. I will continue to fight for it. This bill, it was disappointing. It was a 1% decrease, which is a start. We'll take that, but it wasn't the solution. Anyhow, it was a 1% decrease, so that's something that we can live with. The other one was online sales tax, which was controversial. Our small businesses are competing against online sales that do not pay sales tax. And I don't know if you know this, but as a taxpayer in Kansas, if you purchase something online and sales tax is not collected, you are obligated under Kansas law to pay that sales tax. They want the businesses to collect that instead of the individual being under obligation. And so that's the other portion that the House put in it. It passed the House extensively, and the Senate voted to concur on the House's changes Thursday evening, and we passed it with 24 votes out of the Senate. So it is on the governor's desk.
The senator calls the House made changes. We always call those improvements when we take a Senate bill and add something to it. Yeah, so there's really four components to this bill at this point. One is if you are an itemized filer in Kansas, because we are what's called a rolling conformity state, if you take the standard deduction at the federal level, you have to take the standard deduction at the state level. In the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, the federal government doubled the standard deduction. So it went from about $12,000 to $24,000. So it makes it very advantageous for almost every filer to take that standard deduction. But because we are coupled to the federal system, you then have to take the standard deduction in Kansas, even if you have itemized deductions that exceed that. And let's use a real-world example. The $24,000 is the federal standard deduction. Let's say you had $10,000 or even $12,000 in itemized deductions here in Kansas. Maybe a big medical expense, maybe you have home mortgage interest deduction, maybe you have a lot of charitable giving that you do. If you take that standard deduction at the federal level of $24,000, you drop down to Kansas, and if you're married filing jointly, the standard deduction is $7,500. So you lose either $2,500, or if we say $12,000, you can lose up to $4,500 or more in your itemized deductions that you can't take, because you have to do the same thing at the federal and state level. So what ends up being a tax cut at the federal level because of that bigger standard deduction can lead to increased taxes being paid at the state level. And they estimate that's worth as much as $60 million to Kansas taxpayers, individual filers. Then there are the corporate components. Kansas has never taxed the type of revenue that these countries have made overseas. Because of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, they changed it. They changed that literally from profits to dividends. We've taxed dividends, but we haven't taxed foreign profits, because typically, the theory goes, under our federal model, the federal government handles that taxation of overseas profits, not the states. But we do tax dividends because those are coming back to individuals here in the United States. Well, the federal government just classified all that overseas income as dividends. No rhyme or reason for the states, but states ended up collecting more money because of it. Now, what a lot of states are doing is exactly what Kansas did. And I'm not just talking about red states, I'm talking about blue states as well. New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio have all looked to changes in their tax code in the wake of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act passed at the federal level, because it is an unexpected and unintended consequence of those changes that state taxes are going up for many of those businesses. The other piece, let's talk about the improvements now for a second. The internet sales, or the internet sales tax, is really one of compliance, right? As the senator said, you're supposed to write that down on your tax form, and if you don't, then basically you're cheating on your taxes. And I'm guessing that most of you don't keep track of every online purchase you make and whether or not sales tax was taken out for that, and whether it was taken out at the right rate. And really, for me, it's an issue of fundamental fairness. When I go downtown and I go to Sutton's Jewelry and I buy something, I pay sales tax on it. But if I got online and bought that from a merchant in Missouri, I may not have any sales tax paid on that unless I take the time to keep track of that and report it on my annual tax return. That's not fair. That's not fair that companies that make brick and mortar investments in Kansas are required to collect this tax, and out-of-state businesses can get off scot-free with an unlevel playing field. So this is closing a loophole. It's not raising taxes. It's making sure that everybody is on the same foundation for competition. The final change is this food sales tax cut. I agree with the senator. It'd be nice to get that even lower. But this is a 15% reduction in the food sales tax rate. People say, oh, it's just a penny. It's 15%. The food sales tax rate is 6.5% for the state. It is a significant decrease for every Kansan who goes to the grocery store, and we all go to the grocery store, sometimes more than once a week, sometimes more than I'd like, but we have to go to the grocery store. And so, look, this is a start. Would we like to have done more? Absolutely. But for those who say that this tax plan, they say, oh, this is irresponsible, this is a return to Brownback. It's not a return to Brownback. It's not a cut in rates other than the food sales tax rate. And we had to do something that showed good faith commitment to trying to give some tax relief at the grocery store, and 15% was a good place to start.
Thank you. This is actually probably the toughest piece of legislation I've encountered since I've been there, because I think your question wants to know specifically, how does it help House District 5? And let me start with the good things. The internet sales tax thing is a matter of fairness, and it helps Main Street. I fully agree with that. Itemized deductions is also a good thing for Kansans, keeping that consistent. But how many of us itemize? Not very many. And then of those who do itemize, generally are the perhaps, I don't know if I have the right words for this, but the ability or the sophistication, or I'm an attorney, hire attorneys that are able to help them do that. I don't do tax law, so please don't reach out to me on that. But that was my biggest struggle with a lot of this, because when I went door to door, I had veterans in tears, I had seniors in tears, telling me they needed their property taxes lowered, because that's what's killing rural Kansas. When I moved from Johnson County back to Franklin County, my tax bill, property tax bill on my car doubled. That was $100 or so more that I paid immediately to live in the good county of Franklin. And so the sales tax is also a good thing. And it's a 15% decrease, but it's also 1 penny on a dollar. Or if we go to Walmart or Price Chopper afterwards and have a $100 grocery bill, that means, if I'm not very good at math, but I think that's $1 in savings on a $100 grocery bill. So that doesn't get me very excited, and I don't think that's going to help me look that veteran in Garnett, Kansas, who was in tears because he can't afford to pay his property taxes and about ready to get kicked out of his house. That makes it difficult for me to support what is good things, and the comparisons to the Brownback legislation or the Brownback tax plan are not fair. Those, well, at least they're not accurate. But unfortunately, in my opinion, the folks who will benefit are tend to be a lot of the same folks, and I don't know, to answer specifically your question, that those are most of us here in House District 5. So it's difficult. It made some good improvements, and I agree with Representative Finch that the House did make some improvements to it, but I think there's still a lot more room for improvement. And I think I'll leave it with this, but the other issue that I have with it is there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment in the numbers. We have estimates, and we have estimates upon estimates, and then more estimates, but there's a lot of uncertainty. So I guess if I'm going to put our state at risk again on estimates, at least if I'm going to do it, and the property tax issue is hard. It's a difficult one to understand, and how do you address that fairness? Cutting sales tax is pretty easy, cutting income tax is pretty easy. Property tax is a different animal, because a lot of that's set at the county level. So the concern, and valid concern, in Topeka is if we start cutting certain things in Topeka, how do we ensure that you're then going to get lower property tax levels? And frankly, there's not. It's trusting local leadership, and which again puts it back on the voters to hold all of us accountable. So with that, I hope there's a lot of improvements made, because, like I said, we've got excellent leadership. We have excellent Republican leadership, but the current form of the bill makes it incredibly difficult for me to support right now, and there's a lot of room for improvement. So I suspect I'm running into my time limit, but with that, I'll yield the floor back.
Thank you. Funding of schools is kind of looms over the Capitol now, and I think probably has the entire session. Can you tell us your view on how school funding is going to move forward?
Do you want me to start?
Sure.
Okay. Well, I told you last time that we were here I would bring a chart for you about Kansas expenditures and Kansas revenue. I have a handout. It started in the front and it's going to the back, so that you can look at it. But it does have a graph of the expenditures, and you can find this information online too with legislative research. Also in that packet is a chart of where our state funding money goes. I don't know if you guys can see this, but the blue area is education. We fund over 60% of our budget with K through 12, or with K through 12 education and higher education. I think sometimes you hear the numbers and they don't register with some people. They need a visual. This is a very strong visual as to where our money's going. We have made education a priority in this state. We absolutely have made it a priority. In fact, since 2015, we have increased school funding, K through 12 funding, over $1 billion, almost $1 billion. We've had over $1 billion tax increase since 2015 with our state, and almost all of that money has gone to K through 12 funding. We're to the point where other priorities or other needs in our state are suffering as a result. KDOT, law enforcement, I mean, there's mental health, so many items that need our attention also as legislators. The infrastructure for our state. We need to ask ourselves, where is the money going? Is it getting to the classroom? Is it getting to the teachers? How is the money being spent? We can keep throwing money at this situation all we want. It doesn't solve the problem. We've had 3 chances now to fix the school formula funding. All we did on the last formula was to harm rural schools or schools that are declining populations. It sounds good when we increase the state-based state aid, which is what we keep doing. But when you have schools that are losing population, that means the dollar amount decreases at a greater, faster than if it was based off of other parts of the formula. The formula is extremely complicated. It shouldn't be. We need to allow the locals to spend where they need to, free up the money. And the representative talked about property tax. I'll bring this up really quickly. We pay $4.9 billion in property tax statewide. How much of that do you think goes to fund the state? Any guesses? Less than 1.5%. 1.5% of that $4.9 billion. Almost a majority of it goes to fund our schools, K through 12 or local community colleges. We really need to look at where the money's going and how it's being spent. K through 20 funding is an issue again. The courts have us, I haven't, you know how they used to use the nose rings with the bowl and pull it around? Well, the courts got us by the ring, and the legislature needs to stand up and say, we have the strength, we have the power of the purse, it's ours to decide.
Representative Samsel?
Thank you. I forgot to mention just very briefly on Senate Bill 22, that's actually the next subject of my newsletter. It will show, I did post my explanation of vote, but as hard as that was, they limit us to 100 words there in legislature. That's probably a good word, but I did reluctantly vote in favor of Senate Bill 22. My short explanation's there. My next newsletter is going to cover that into detail, so that's where I'm at on the issues. I always welcome constructive feedback to tell me where I'm wrong and where it can be improved. Particularly the latter part, if you can give me a better solution, we can get those through. But I mentioned that because I handed this out to some of you already. But this was my newsletter that I sent back in January. So I was 2 weeks into the legislature, and this is where I was at on education funding. It's still where I'm at today. I've gotten a lot of emails on education funding, some helpful, some not so helpful, but nothing that's really changed from where I'm at on this. And Senator Tyson absolutely just described some of the problems we have with education funding. Accountability, transparency, how we fund them, those all comes to mind. What I think the three of us will all agree on, and I'm wondering if anybody in the room would have a different opinion, but Representative Finch actually helped me understand this, and I believe it to be true, but it is the legislature and not the courts that are best situated to decide how education funding should best be spent. That's not because we're smarter. I might think we are, we probably are, but it's because we're most responsive to the people and your needs. And then secondary to that, that's why the legislative branch comes first in the Constitution. After that, later on, is the courts. And the courts are supposed to be a fallback, so when we don't meet those minimum thresholds, they're there. But we've gone from, and I'm an attorney, so this means a lot to me to protect the Constitution, but we have one word in the Constitution that says suitable. It was then explained through opinions for purely good intent, but that then involves adequacy components and, what's my other one? Adequate and equitable. So those are your two components, and now we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of what that's supposed to mean. And so at the end of the day, we're paying attorneys a lot of money to do that, and so I think I'm starting to bloviate again, so I need to quit saying that. But if you will check out my newsletter, though, that in much more succinct form says where I'm at on education. To get to the point here, Senate just passed, I believe it's Senate Bill 142. It doesn't solve all the issues that Senator Tyson just validly described, but it does. I'm a firm believer that we need to get this lawsuit over with. And then all of these issues that we've talked about, let's decide those, but let's decide those through vigorous debate in the people's house instead of in the court system. Because I'm confident at the end of the day, I'll use one example here. I talk with my school administrators on a regular basis. They 100% support Senate Bill 142 to get this lawsuit over with, and let's move forward from there. But I want to use Osawatomie School District as an example because he somewhat jokingly, but also somewhat, I think, validly told me in one of our phone conferences that he would be willing to give up his local control of his school district to join the Blue Valley School District because of the money and the resources they have there. But think about giving up local control of your kids and your schools and the risks that entail with that. What the real problem is we don't have a funding formula in place. We put all this money into our schools, and yet the good people of Osawatomie and probably Wellsville, Central Heights, Colony, and Garnett, if they really wanted to improve their school facilities and even come remotely close to what the Blue Valleys have, we don't have a school funding formula in place that's going to enable them to do that for our kids here. And we've got some of the best kids, brightest kids, and frankly, in a lot of ways, I think more talented and real life skills than what we've got in Johnson County, but we as a state have to find a better way to enable them. So with that, not because I don't know, I'll leave. If you can check out the newsletter, I welcome any comments from that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I think one of the things that tends to happen with school finance and some of the other issues in Topeka is we get to the point where we're talking past each other and people begin to take umbrage about things and it becomes personal. And I want to make sure today that it is not personal. I think that our school system is amongst the finest in the nation. We have great teachers, we have great administrators, and there are needs that our schools have. And they face a growing array of challenges, including mental health challenges for young people who are coming into school that have problems that simply cannot be addressed between 7:30 and 3:07 every day. And so thanks to those of you who are educators in the room, thanks to those of you who are in administration for the work that you do. I think it's often unheralded, and I think when we talk about funding, it's easy for people to assume that what's being said is you don't matter, that you don't have value, that you're not adding to the public good in Kansas, and nothing could be further from the truth. We appreciate you and we thank you for the work that you do. The discussion of how much money should be put into the system is different. And the reality is that I think what we're seeing, and if you look at the senator's chart, and here's another one, this is state general fund by sector. That black line at the top is K-12. It is far and away above everything else that we spend on. Public education is and should be the biggest priority in our state budget. There's no doubt about that. I think we would all agree with that. But everything else begins to come second when you look at what we've had to do in response to these court decisions. This is a graph that shows new money spent on K-12 education in the state of Kansas since the first Gannon decision. The blue line was the equity fix. You see it running on out there into the future. Then in 2017, we passed the orange line, and that was when Larry Campbell, who's now the governor's budget director, was the K-12 budget chairman in the House. He said, "This will do it, guys. This will resolve the case. We'll be done. Everything will be fine." Of course, it wasn't. Came back and said, "No, we need more money." So then we got the gray line. That's the one that was passed last year. That was Senate Bill 61. I want you to note, we're right here. There's a whole lot more money coming to public education in the state of Kansas. About $500 million more because of last year's Senate Bill 61. And that little yellow line at the top, that's what the Senate just passed. That's $90 million a year. And I'll point out to you that the plaintiffs in the lawsuit last week decided that that wasn't enough. On February 6th, they showed up and testified, "We'll be happy with that. We'll take that and we'll end the litigation." And then 2 weeks later, they changed their mind and decided that that wasn't enough. They wanted 4 times that much. They want this to be $360 million more in this yellow bar when you get out here to 2023.
If I may, it's a $1.8 billion increase by the time they're finished with that, what they want.
700 million more than this current yellow bar and 1.8 billion in total new spending for K-12. If that were to pass, the total amount spent on K-12 in 2023 would be equal to the total tax receipts of the state of Kansas in 2014. Within a decade, every dollar that we collected in taxes in 2014 would be equal to the amount we're spending on one section of our state budget. That is not sustainable. Regardless of how much you value public education and the people who work in that field, it's simply not sustainable in a state of 3 million people, a state facing other challenges with a graying population and decreasing population in the western part of the state. All of this assumes, and I want to tell you something, we can't afford that gray bar. We made a promise we really can't afford to keep in those out years. The state's not going to have that money when we get to 2023. The governor's budget, and she said as much in her State of the State, rests on several assumptions. One, that we would refinance the state pension system and add $7.4 billion in spending. Two, that we wouldn't do anything with taxes at all, including that Senate Bill 22 that we just talked about. Three, we'd have to keep sweeping from the highway fund. And four, we'd have to have no recession at all. By 2024, that would put us at 14 years of peacetime expansion, the single longest expansion in history and unprecedented. I hope it happens, but odds are that it won't. And so the current funding system is not really sustainable. Adding 90 million or 360 million is equally not sustainable. We have to find a way to have education be our priority and fund it, but leave room in our budget for the other things that matter. So what will happen with school finance this session? We're still working on it. I've had meetings with superintendents. I've been in meetings with superintendents. I've been in discussions with the governor and her staff. I've been in discussions with Senate leadership. Far from the reports in the public that this isn't being taken seriously and that people are not doing serious work on it. We are. We are absolutely cognizant of it and trying to come to grips with how we can both comply with the court's decision and make promises that we can actually fund in the out years. There are some who want us to pass more money for education so the governor has to make allotments so that the budget actually is busted in the out years. That's a political strategy that some want to implement. I'm not among them. I don't think that's a good idea. I think that our funding has to be within our means, and it's got to be something that is sustainable.
As our time is short, I'm going to ask Ms. Laurel Gimzo to actually bring the mic to somebody who may have a question. As you raise your hand, I want to just send kind of set some parameters for you, which I know many of you already know. We ask that you only ask one question per person. Please hold your applause. Let as many questions come forward as you can. Please ask a question. Statements are not allowed, and Laura will take your mic if we need to. And please turn your cell phone off if you are here, and we're glad people are calling you, but if it can wait 20 minutes, that would be great. So if you have a question, if you would please raise your hand. Looks like you have one up here.
Karen, I guess you're the person I need to ask this of, but could you give us an update on Bill 124, Senate Bill 124?
Would you refresh my memory?
That's the Corporation Commission giving Evergy the power to gain fees back from those people that are trying to reduce their energy costs by going solar.
I haven't heard anything on that bill, and I'm not on the Utilities Committee. And you guys, I do not have internet access on this phone. There's a reason I have not decided to sign my life away to Google yet. So I can't look the bill up while we're up here. But I don't know the status of that bill right now. It has not made it out of committee that I'm aware of.
Yeah, it's still in committee. It
Yeah,
had a hearing
it's-
on the 25th.
It had a hearing on the 25th of February. Utilities is a big issue. That's, we are one of the highest in the surrounding area on our utility bills. we had a bill that did pass the Senate floor this week that would allow a study. I had mixed feelings on the bill, but after listening to debate and what was in the bill, I concluded that it would be a good step forward for Kansas. We don't have a good track record as a state for hiring outside studies. So I was very reluctant and questioned the path that this was going to take in order to find that third party. It is a study that would look at the utilities, what they are charging, why we are so much higher than everyone else in the surrounding areas. And it's an issue. It's a big issue. I don't know if you guys have seen, and most of you may not realize this, it came up a few years ago. You do not pay sales tax on your utilities in Kansas, which is a good thing. However, there's a group in Topeka that would like to remove all sales tax exemptions. When they start talking about this, I try to explain to them what is all exempted. I don't think they realize what they are asking for when they ask for all sales tax exemptions, and that is one of them that would be removed. It would put an automatic 6.5% increase on your utility bills. I don't think Kansas wants that, and I know my constituents aren't clamoring for it.
You may be required or requested to vote on this issue at some time, and it appears that the utilities are trying to destroy the solar industry in the state. So you might look seriously at that.
Yeah, I will. I read the bills before I vote on them. I have a reputation in Topeka for being diligent and for working for my constituents.
While Laura looks for the next question, I'm going to ask you on a follow-up with that, Senator Tyson, regarding that electric rate study. It appears as though the Senate approved $1 million for an electric rate study, and I'm wondering if you could tell your electors about how that study is actually going to be funded.
That study is going to be well, if it passed the Senate, but it still has to go to the House, and it still has to be signed by the governor or else not signed, allowed to become law, or vetoed. The funding source is your utility. They do put, I think it's up to a 50-cent increase on your utility bill to fund it. But it is a part-time, it's a small fee, it doesn't last forever. What happened, if you remember, with the 2017 windfall, they call it the windfall because the utility companies had tax cuts also from the federal government. We never saw that cut passed on to us as utility players. I tried to pass a resolution. We got it out of the Senate Tax Committee last year that said we want that tax savings passed on to consumers. It didn't happen. So this raised a flag, and people started looking into how high our utility rates are. We started to look into the process and what happened in the past. And the best thing that the committee could come up with was a study. It was an agreement by all sides, and it is funded by us, the consumers. But I feel like either we keep going forward as we are without knowing where why our utility bills are as high as they are, or we get to take a deep dive and understand and find ways of savings, because that income tax savings should have been passed on to the consumers. It wasn't. Have any of you seen a lowering in your utility bills in the last year? Oh, I got one. You guys did? Oh, bravo. Okay, so 3-4 people out of 70. I question what's going on. So,
Sure.
thank you.
Yes, Representative Samsel.
And actually, this was one of my points that I wanted to mention earlier, because you had a very good, I hear that all the time, and to Senator Tyson's credibility there, we get asked to look at bills all the time there are hundreds and hundreds of those, and it's tough to keep up with them. So I can tell you from my very short experience there, what is most persuasive and helpful for me, this is my help wanted, but if you're a local expert on one of these issues, and it sounds like energy might be one of yours, that's incredibly helpful for me. If you can give me the title of the bill, because I probably am not an expert on it. I've tried to get up to speed pretty good on school, finance. I mean, the things that Representative Finch mentioned earlier about priorities when we heard knocking on doors. Mental health, which I don't think we've really hit on yet today, and we've been going hard for 45 minutes. It's not because we're not working hard, it's just with all these other issues. School, the foster kids, the transportation. I had a gentleman yesterday, I spent an hour on the phone with him about robocalls. Very good, it is a problem, you're probably all getting those same phone calls, but that is the solution to it's complicated, and I am certainly not the expert, but if you can find the solution to that one, you will be one of my favorite people very quickly. But I don't have time to go research that issue, not because it's not important, but because of the other issues on our desk. So I just wanted to add in there, though, if you are one of those local experts, and when these issues pop up from time to time, if I have your contact info, you're the first person I reach out to. Wendy Belcher, for example, we have an APRN issue coming through. And I'm not, there's a reason I went to law school and not medical school. I don't like the blood and all that stuff. But she's a doctor in Garnett. She's one of our best. She is incredibly helpful for me. She not only answers my questions, but when I have constituents come to me, I direct her to her, and she is more than happy to help with them. The last thing I'll mention that if you are willing to help, much like my officiating job, it's very low pay, probably volunteer, but it is incredibly rewarding when you get to see the results of your efforts come through. So thank you for that.
Other questions?
Yes. You wanted to talk about mental health, and I think now would be a good time because of the fact that the suicide rate in Kansas has risen 45% since 1989, thus making Kansas the 5th highest rate of suicide amongst all of the states in the United States. And basically with the fact that we're losing hospitals, which are the front line for basically you might say, treating people who are suicidal, and the fact that farmers are also considered to be one of the highest rates groups affected by suicide in the country. I see basically the state of Kansas as being extremely quiet on that subject.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question, and I want to start with something that is a fact, and I hope we can all agree on. But 1 out of 4 of us is affected by a mental health issue, and it does not discriminate. Unfortunately, yesterday we had constituents in from Senator Tyson's and I's district from the Iola area, and we learned of a young lady in my school. This is Crest High School, committed suicide last year. She was a 4.0 student, extremely successful, appeared incredibly happy, but we failed when it comes to mental health. We weren't able to get in proactively early enough and address those issues. Here's the good news. I learned, if you haven't been to Osawatomie State Hospital yet, that's also in my district, I strongly encourage you to go there. They are incredibly friendly people. It will be eye-opening for you. And actually, before I forget to mention this earlier, I sent out these questionnaires. These are incredibly important to me because this is your voice. I've tallied them. I will show what those results are when we leave here today, but a lot of them were quite eye-opening. The education finance, for example, 69% of my district supports what the Senate bill has just sent to the House, so I'm optimistic that will pass through very quickly, and then focus on all the issues that still exist to the increased spending in education. But back to the health care, to me, it's one that Kansans should lead. We did it 150 years ago. It was the leader in the nation for mental health care. If you're a fiscal conservative, it was at zero taxpayer expense. The people that we brought in were there for as long as they needed to be, but they were productive. They ran the cafeteria, they ran the post office, they were artistic, all of the skills that they had, but through the mental health challenges they encountered, it was inhibiting those abilities. But it's also, this was shocking to me, but it was such a nice facility that you would bring your daughter or your granddaughter there to have their wedding, because it's a beautiful area out there. Not today, it's not. The land is, but the facility's not. But they could make money from that. They generated revenue just like You go to Johnson County or somewhere else today at these nice big venues. We were doing that in Osawatomie. There's no reason we can't do that again. And so, but at the end of the day, if you were the fiscal conservative, we were breaking even and getting great results in the state of Kansas. There's no reason we can't go back to that soon. You see all these nice schools that we've built in Johnson County, or these nice stadiums we've built, Sporting Kansas City. Why can't we have a mental health facility, something of that nature, to get positive outcomes and again get it back where it pays for itself? And right now, again, this is fiscal conservatism, but if you go through the Osawatomie area and actually in all of our small communities, we've got the Big 12 tournament here in town today. This is just one example. Let's say we've got an Iowa State fan in town, and something he's encountered, a bad situation, something goes bad, but the individuals in our community, where they're at their worst, a low moment of life, and he's at the bridge deciding whether to jump or not. This happens in our communities. Sometimes it's our own people, sometimes it's our own visitors from out of town, but what taxpayer resources do we use in that situation? Our law enforcement, our ambulance, our medical staff, and then once we address it, hopefully we're able to save the person and doesn't jump. But from there, they're often in a jail cell for 1 to however many days at taxpayer expense. Then we send them over through our court system to figure out what we're going to do. And then if they end up in Osawatomie State Hospital, unfortunately, they would be the first one to tell you that the outcomes aren't very good right now. We use medication and we get them to a point where we send them back to our local facilities in the community. But that all cost a ton of taxpayer money, and we're not getting very good results right now. So I don't know if that specifically answered your question, but I don't want to start, I won't use that word again, but keep rambling. We'll go with rambling for this time. But I'll let, whether it's Representative Finch or Senator Tyson, but let them speak on it. But I could go on and on and on mental health, so.
I can jump in.
Okay.
I've been part of passing 2 bills in each of the last 2 sessions on trying to help the mental health situation. The first was the EOT bill, Emergency Observation and Treatment, or what we call crisis intervention, for those who are in mental health crisis, however that manifests itself, whether a threat to harm others or a threat to harm themselves, including suicidal ideation. And then we followed it up the year after with the juvenile crisis intervention bill, and that we moved $2 million in funding from cost savings that we had realized because of juvenile justice reform to try to jumpstart those centers and get them created around the state. It will take much more than that $2 million. It will take a large influx of cash to help the mental health system. We've talked previously and talking about school finance, about where the dollars are going and the priority that we need to place on some other areas, including mental health. There is a mental health pilot program that we put in last year's school bill that's showing some success, according to the Legislative Post-Audit Division, and the House version of the school finance bill expands that program this year and works very similarly to what we know as school resource officers, where we're putting law enforcement officers inside schools at splitting the cost. This puts mental health professionals inside schools and helps split the cost. So that we get young people the treatment and access to mental health services that they need. When we met last with the Osawatomie State Hospital staff, they told us that really the issue is not crisis beds, although they're working to lift the moratorium. The real issue is transition facilities. How do we take people who have been in crisis, who go on a care and treatment case to Osawatomie or Larned, they're there for a few days, they're stabilized, and then they want to release them back into the community? We don't have transition facilities to help move people from that acute crisis moment out into working their way back into life on a regular basis. So oftentimes they're just released. They go back home. They might have an order from the court that they have to work with their community mental health center. They have to go to outpatient treatment. But if they don't, there's really no consequence for that. There's no transition facility to help make sure they're stabilized long term. So you talk about creating the facility, hiring the staff, doing all of that, not just here, but around the state. It's an incredible investment that has to be made. And so you can see why when we have the kind of pressures on our budget to put $1 billion in one area, it's hard to find what would likely be tens of millions of dollars that we would need for a program like that to get it spooled up and running. I do believe the future of mental health care in our state is regional. It's not going to be 2 state hospitals. It's going to be multiple facilities around the state where people can get treatment, where we can reduce the stigma of being in the state hospital, and people can get treatment they need at whatever level they need it, and then can get back into the community. So it is a multifaceted problem. It's not one that lends itself to easy solutions and sound bites, but we are trying, and I have tried the last several years to do what we can to move us in a direction of having better acute mental health crisis care.
Yes, and my track record shows that I've been a strong supporter and worked diligently on the mental health issue, not just Osawatomie, but the community mental health centers and with law enforcement and others that are involved. It impacts all of us, whether we realize it or not. We did pass legislation a couple years ago that required training in our schools for suicide prevention. We also, there's many things that we have done besides what Representative Finch mentioned. One of the items with that school pilot program was, though, it was $10 million for 5 school districts. And yeah, it didn't list any rural school districts to be part of that pilot program. It all went to larger communities. So we need to keep in mind that those programs need to include us, not just our larger communities. It is an issue. I am working with law enforcement right now. It was the sheriff's main #1 issue in their meeting this summer. So we do need to address mental health. You know where I stand. We help those that cannot help themselves. And this is a situation where people are in need. Most families do not have the resources or the capacity to help in a mental health situation. So it is a crisis, and it is on our radar.
If I can leave one sound bite, I learned this one last week. We have a mental health caucus. We focus on this. I want to leave you with before stage 4. That's a hashtag. You can find the Kansas Mental Health Association on there, but they compare it to cancer. If we haven't discovered the problem before stage 4, you guys know what comes from that. Mental health's the same thing. We often wait way too long down the line. So before stage 4 is a good one that I liked and will be promoting.
One last question? Yes.
Blaine, you mentioned that school funding was going to require $500 million extra dollars. I don't know where that was on the timeline. At the same time, we're looking at this windfall that is $500 million, $500 million, correct?
No.
Okay.
No, that's not the right amount. There's 2 factors that go into computing that cost. The $500 million is a multi-year comment or a multi-year projection. It's not necessarily accurate. The repatriation money is one-time money. The GILTI, the low intangibles tax, is about $30 million a year. And we talked about the itemization for individual filers, and I think that's between 50 and 60. The other piece of that is that the budget projections, Kansas bases its budget on the consensus revenue estimates. If the money is not put into the consensus revenue estimates, it's not shown in the budget. And there is dispute amongst the researchers as to whether they put in $0 for this or whether they put in about $100 million. But at most, the hit to the budget can only be what they have projected to receive for that revenue. And so at a maximum, the effect on the budget will be $100 million because that's all that they had projected as additional revenue based on the windfall numbers. So I know it's a little bit complicated. It's insider state budget kind of math, but imagine if you projected that you were going to get $100 million and in reality you don't get that. The hit to your budget is $100 million, not $500 million over 3 years.
Well, if I may respond to that briefly too, I find it incredibly complicated and difficult to understand and hard to find time to fully flesh it out. But I definitely get we're giving the appearance, I think is what I'm hearing from you, that we're getting ready to rush through handouts is not a good word, but money back to big corporations when we talked about property taxes earlier, which is another incredibly difficult issue. But then our schools, it doesn't seem as though we're in quite a hurry to fund the schools and get this lawsuit over with. And I'm transparent with everything I say. Sometimes I'm right, sometimes I'm wrong. When I go ref games, I frequently reminded of that. I see Brian Spencer in the back of the room. His Central Heights Vikings could attest to that one. He's our superintendent down there in Central Heights and does an outstanding job. But I do, and if I'm an attorney, I advise my clients all the time. This education funding issue is nothing new. We've been debating it for a very long time in Kansas. We're close to the finish line, and that's why I want to get it done out of the courts, and then let's debate all these issues back in the legislative body. Because in fairness to the plaintiffs, I think they've been at the table for the while and ready to get this done for the $90 million price tag. There's issues with that. It's in my newsletter. I described what those are, but I still think that's the best result right now for Kansas. But if I were their attorney, I would have advised them to do the same thing. If you're going to be at the table with $90 million and they're not going to get that done over the last month and a half, well, let's jump your numbers up and act like we want a whole bunch more money. If that's really what they're thinking, I will tell you, they're not going to have my support behind it. I think the $90 million is what the Supreme Court ordered. That's precedent, and we can comply with that. In fact, the Constitution requires that we comply with that. I'll leave with this last line, but the Supreme Court's not always right because they're the last ones there. They're the last ones because they get the last say there. I think I got that backwards. But essentially, they're not the smartest people in the room necessarily. Watch that quote go to my learned colleagues over in the Supreme Court. But what they say is the last word on the subject is what I'm meaning. It's not an issue that can go up to the U.S. Supreme Court. There is no U.S. constitutional issue there. So, and you'll see in my newsletter, there is talk of a constitutional amendment, and there has been for some time. There are plenty of good reasons the Constitution should be changed. And it could be improved in a whole lot of ways. But if we do that right now, how is that going to appear to the Supreme Court? And who gets to decide whether it's retroactive or not? Meaning, does that apply after we finally finish this lawsuit, or does it apply right now? And whether they're right or they're wrong, it's those 7 justices on the Supreme Court. So that's why at the end of the day, sometimes I don't have real strong feelings on things, but this is one of them I do. Get this lawsuit over with all of the flaws that may entail and spending problems, but get that back so that the good senators and good representatives can argue about those things in the Capitol instead of over across the street in the Supreme Court.
The time tells me it's 11:02, which ends actually our legislative coffee. I wonder if you might be willing to just entertain one final question from me.
Sure.
My calendar shows that there's less than 10 days that you have under the dome before first adjournment. I wonder if you could tell your electors, maybe those that are sitting here in the audience or those that may be listening later or those that participate in another way to have a conversation with you, how you are working with your colleagues across the aisle to make sure that Kansas is moving forward.
Mine's a very easy one. Immediately comes to mind, bullying legislation. I've actually been working with my superintendents on it every single week. It's not perfect. It's got a long ways to go, but it's designed to address students. That's our future. They've got the things, man, I thought it was hard when we came through school. They've got cell phones. They see videos and Snapchats and things that would boggle my mind. Then they go into our school buildings and talk about issues and bathroom stalls and all that stuff that only adds to anxiety, stress, and things that teenagers are already thinking about. And then perhaps bullying is not a good word because everyone has a different version of what they think that means, and maybe 9 times out of 10, that's not really what's taken place. And much like refs, they're going to have to learn how to develop some thick skin. But as the young girl, and this maybe is not the best example, but the young lady who we lost over in Colony and Crest High School, we have issues with that. So I've been working very closely with House leadership, solid Republicans and solid Democrats to try to move bullying legislation through. We have very good school district leaders in our district. Still room for improvement, but in some other areas of our state, perhaps, we've all got room for improvement, I guess I'll say. But so we're trying to work very hard to get bullying legislation through in these next 10 days for the benefit of every single one of our students. That doesn't address the larger mental health issues we have for our older folks across the state, our veterans, our farmers. Again, mental health doesn't discriminate, but in my limited time in the legislature so far, we're close to the finish line on getting bullying legislation through, so that would be my example.
Thank you, Representative Samsel.
I would just say, you've talked about the big issues this morning. That's what we're going to keep working on. We're going to keep working on school finance and trying to find the solution there that not only ends the litigation but leads to long-term stability so our educators can plan for the future. We're going to be working on finding long-term budget solutions that lead to a stable and consistent state budget so that we are not up and down, and that citizens of the state and people who look at locating here know that this is a place where it's stable. And we're going to look at improving the quality of life for Kansans through things like mental health improvements and trying to take care of our foster care system and our criminal justice system. So those are the things that we've been working on. Those are the things we're going to keep working on over the next 13 days.
Well, I want to thank you guys again for coming out. I do reach across the aisle to work with my colleagues. In fact, I chair the Senate Tax Committee. We have an excellent committee. All Republicans and Democrats feel like they can participate and contribute. We actually debate the bills in committee. I know that's foreign to some people, but we work the bills. We work hard and we work diligently, and they feel like they can contribute. So I do work well with my colleagues.
Great. I want to give you just one last moment if you want to say anything, closing out this March legislative coffee. Representative Samsel?
Thank you. I'll keep this short. Before you all leave, if you're interested in seeing it, I'm transparent whether you like me or not. These four, actually, we had 350 responses from our district. I'm proud of that very overwhelming response. I have 4 right here that have not yet been opened, just came in this morning's mail. So if you want to experience Christmas morning and open one of these things, you can see where these 4 fall in the fun comments that you may get. Some are constructive, some of them may call me names, but if you want to test your luck on those, there's 4 of them right there for you. But those have been compiled. Huge kudos to my office assistant, Bev. She does a tremendous job. She's come a long way too. When we first started in Topeka, she would be the first to admit she did not know how to use Microsoft Outlook. So emails, calendaring events, when you guys call me and have issues, that was added to we're kind of a one-man show. It's now getting on board to a 2-man show. But these are the results of the survey. These were eye-opening to me. You are welcome to see those. They're also going to go in my next newsletter, so you'll be able to see those there. And then I want to end one that we touched on mental health, but healthcare is one that I would like us to seriously think about moving forward, because we're getting ready to have very difficult debates on CanCare expansion, the Farm Bureau bill, and things that I applaud. But when I stop and think about healthcare, I use the Iowa State fan. I can give you an example from a junior in Lewisburg, Miami County over there. His son got kicked in the head by a mule, didn't have insurance, went to the hospital, $600,000 later. Who's going to pay for it? When our parents and grandparents start to encounter dementia or cancer or other, who's paying for all of these things? The conclusion that I keep coming back to is that you, me, and every Kansan here pays for everybody's health care. Sometimes that's through insurance, sometimes it's through Medicaid, Medicare, but when nobody has insurance, because your other alternative is they report to the hospital, and if it's through an ambulance or something else, it's even more expensive. But we pay for it all, and if that means the hospital doesn't get paid, we indirectly pay for it when they pass those costs on to the rest of us who are all paying for their bills. So to me, that's an American issue, and it's a federal issue, and that's why I look forward to working with our congressmen and senators in Washington, D.C., because I do think it's a federal American issue. We can do our best here in Kansas, and that's why I applaud Farm Bureau for trying to come up with the improvements that they have. But at the end of the day, those look much more short-term fixes and perhaps improvements than what we really need. And I don't want to take away from somehow being an advocate of Obamacare from this thing, but the underlying point of that thing is that it was trying to cover everybody and get everybody insured in some way, shape, or form, because whether they're insured or not, if you're a fiscal conservative, what we pay for healthcare right now in America has huge issues. So I look forward to hopefully that debate becoming more front and center in Washington, D.C. with real results. You've seen the headlines of what we've been debating the last few days in Washington, D.C. So With that, I want to applaud both the senator and representative here. I 100% mean they're two of our best over in Topeka. And then I do also want to thank the chamber and everybody else for showing up this morning. It's important, and appreciate all of your input in this process.
Thank you all for coming out. Hope you enjoy the sunshine today and the fact there's no snow.
Thank you guys again for coming out. You know, we didn't touch on a lot of issues, broadband, internet access, foster care. There's so many facing the state. I look forward to hearing from you and your concerns and representing you in Topeka. Thank you.
Rock Chalk.
Our next legislative coffee is Saturday, April 20th at 10 a.m. Hope to see you all there.